All right. Well, we might as well get going, and we'll have more folks trickling in, I'm sure, at least judging by the number of RSVPs. So welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Michael Calabrese. I'm a senior research fellow here with our Open Technology Initiative and direct our Wireless Future project. For many years, we've been focused on this mobile wireless industry and on spectrum issues and so on. So it's a real pleasure to have this. We're asking a question today: should the FCC ensure wireless device choice and interoperability? And actually, I just want to preface one thing, which is, folks may want to, turn off or turn down your cell phones, and we are webcasting this event. We'll have an audience online. So please, later when we get to audience questions, if you could introduce yourself in terms, your affiliation, and speak directly into the mic, that will really help our audio and folks on the web. So this event today is co-sponsored with Consumers Union, and Parul Desai is here on the panel, and she'll actually be the first up among the panelists because I guess part of, at least the known news today, will come from Consumers Union. Parul's releasing the results of some consumer survey questions that shed light on consumer preferences in this marketplace. So the context, I'll give you some context and then introduce our moderator and get out of your way. But let me give a little bit of background so that the panelists won't. Last week, I'm sure as many of you know, the FCC adopted a broadband data roaming order. And this requires carriers to permit the customers of competitors to roam onto their network at, quote, commercially reasonable rates, subject to arbitration by the FCC if necessary. So on one level, this seems like nothing new. Consumers are accustomed to seamless interconnection and roaming for cell phone calls, a competition policy that's been around since the original cell phone licenses. But perhaps this more consequential emerging market for mobile internet access, there is a catch to this, which is going to be part of the debate here. While roaming is required now in theory, the dominant nationwide 4G networks are being built out on the 700 megahertz band. You may recall those are the TV channels that were taken away from broadcasters during the DTV transition and auctioned in early 2008 for $19 billion. And in the 700 megahertz band, unlike prior allocations of paired spectrum for mobile phones, the devices sold or authorized by different carriers will not necessarily interoperate. The FCC is allowing proprietary subbands, at least at this point, which is a fundamental shift in competition policy that leaves a huge loophole in the roaming order, at least from our point of view and from a couple of the folks on the panel's point of view. So I should disclose, I guess, that New America is not exactly neutral on this issue. We filed comments in the proceeding, both in roaming and on the petition that was filed by a couple, Sprint and the Rural Cellular Association and other smaller carriers, petitioning the FCC over 18 months ago to require interoperability in the 700 megahertz band to make roaming meaningful. So we filed as part of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition with Consumers Union and other groups. We argued that balkanization of the 700 band and any structural barrier to interoperability reduces consumer choice of devices. We argued that interoperability would give consumers of every carrier a wider choice of devices at a lower unit cost. It would also allow consumers to move more freely between carriers without having to, junk their device or purchase a new one. PISC wrote that this also fosters innovation in both devices and applications, since manufacturers and developers would have the largest possible market for cool toys. And as you'll hear from some on the panel, the lack of interoperability greatly disadvantages the smaller rural and regional carriers by raising their costs and deterring, their potential consumers. They essentially need to convince chip and device makers to customize things just for them, losing economies of scale enjoyed by the very largest carriers. We have argued more broadly, and hopefully this will come up a little bit here. I know Larry Spywak has written about it in the past, that we've argued more broadly for Carterfone consumer choice. That is the ability, as we have in the wired world, under the 1968 Carterfone order from the FCC, that's the ability of consumers to connect any safe device, run any application, or access any website, just as we have in the wireline world. Extend that to wireless. So a little over a year ago, we put out a study by the Columbia Telecommunications Corp., which is an engineering firm in the public interest, that showed that, especially as mobile carriers converge around a single LTE standard, advanced LTE in particular, that it should be very feasible to extend Carterfone consumer choice from the wireline to the wireless world. We argued this would both greatly increase consumer choice, but also increase competition in the adjacent markets in a way that promotes more competition in general for mobile broadband. So now I'd like to, as I said, get out of your way by introducing our moderator, Rob Pegoraro. Rob is the Washington Post, I think as everybody here probably knows, he's the Washington Post consumer technology columnist, for now, today, but covers a whole lot more ground than that. I think he says on his site that he's published in articles in every section of the paper, and he writes the Post, most notably writes the Post's Fast Forward column in print, a weekly look at computers, the internet, and consumer electronics. And online, he does a lot more, including the Faster Forward blog, hosting web chats, and he'll run off to do one immediately after this event, so we'll actually end on time, and holds forth ceaselessly on Twitter. So if you so you can tune in on a different channel even while the event's going on through Rob's tweets. This is also sad to say, as he was suggesting, Rob's last official day writing and web chatting for the Post. He's been there over 17 years, but as part of our incredibly shrinking Washington Post, with buyout after buyout, we're going to have less rich coverage of technology and telecom, unfortunately, and consumers will lose a champion in the local press here. So Rob, it's going to be really a big hole here in Washington, but I hope you'll stay on the national scene and inform us in other ways. Let's give Rob a round of applause, because he's just been an incredible force in informing these debates. So I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. So, yeah, I guess I thought, well, I can't really top that introduction, but if you all want to sort of say a few words about yourself and how you're coming to this, and then we'll get to the questions. We can just go right.
And you can go to the podium or from there, whichever.
I can just speak from here. So thanks to Numerica for hosting this event, and framing-wise, not surprisingly, no one in this room should be surprised. I agree with everything that Michael said in his opening, and so I will try to keep it brief. But I think everyone in this room understands and knows that mobile communications and mobile broadband is becoming more and more important to consumers and to businesses. And so we've been working to try to ensure that we have a competitive marketplace so that consumers can benefit from more choices and lower prices. And as we think about what the competitive marketplace looks like, there are obviously a lot of moving pieces that we've been looking at to ensure and to facilitate that the market is a consumer-friendly market. And we won't get to all those issues today, but as carriers begin to invest in their 700 megahertz holdings and we continue to think about competition policy, one important piece is the piece that Michael alluded to or talked about was interoperability. And we think interoperability is important to ensure consumer confidence in that their devices will work regardless of their carrier, and that their ability to roam seamlessly among carrier to carrier, network to network is uninhibited. And so, as Michael said, we get there by requiring interoperability, and that is mobile devices operating in the 700 megahertz band must be able to operate across the band. And without interoperability, our concern is that competition will be undermined, which would ultimately harm consumers with higher prices and lower choices. And I don't think this is, this isn't and shouldn't be a pie in the sky dream. We've had interoperability requirements before, and it's critical that we continue to ensure the benefits of interoperability, and that's ensuring that consumers continue to or will be able to take their devices with them, and that we don't see the current trend or lock in the current trend of locking handsets to specific providers. And we at Consumers Union did conduct a recent nationwide poll that found that consumers do support the idea that cell phone handsets should be compatible across all U.S. cellular services. There's more information about the survey in the back on the table that gives you more details as to the questions and responses, but some highlights according to the poll are that virtually all respondents, 97%, felt that consumers should be able to keep their existing handsets when changing carriers. An overwhelming majority, 88%, said that their handset should work on any cellular network. Virtually all, 97%, felt that consumers should be able to keep their existing handsets when changing carriers. And 73% said they would strongly support a government rule that requires handsets to be compatible with all U.S. cellular services. And not surprisingly, this view was supported most strongly by smartphone users, and that number was 81%. So to me, the results of the poll underscore the need that decisions have to be made now. And as we continue to put off making these important decisions and we continue to go down towards balkanization or fragmentation of the 700 megahertz band, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle once you've already cemented a certain standard. And so, ultimately our hope is that the FCC will look at this quickly so that the market is able to evolve in a way that's consumer friendly, so that consumers have more choices and are the beneficiaries of lower prices.
I assume somebody wants to disagree with that. Whoever.
Are we going to do a 5 minutes opening statement from everybody? Or?
Well,
Yeah, I think I should have said the format, which I think the panelists know. You can make it.
It's a 5-minute opening statement, a 1-minute rebuttal, and then a 30-second re-rebuttal after that. There'll be a green light.
Why don't we go straight down from?
Okay, yeah, that works.
Sure. Well, thank you, Michael and Rob, and thanks for having me here today, and thank you to everyone for coming. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with opening remarks, but I think Parole has given me a place to jump off from. And certainly Sprint has, for quite a while now, been very much in support of interoperability at 700 megahertz. And we have been with Steve's group and Michael's and others on that point. And I think it's the way we came to it really was almost more from the public safety perspective, and that was that if public safety is going to have a nationwide interoperable network based at 700 megahertz in the public safety broadband spectrum, and potentially the D block as well, wouldn't it be better if public safety agencies had the ability to also use spectrum, roam on, or enter into agreements, partnerships with all 700 megahertz licensees, and perhaps if willing carriers and public safety agencies are so willing, even beyond 700 megahertz. So we have been part of a coalition that has filed a number of pleadings on that subject, and there's no technical barrier to minimizing the band classes at 700 megahertz. We have proposed and provided technical studies that suggest that you could have one band class for the upper 700 megahertz and one for the lower. The bottom line is, what would that do? That would, as Michael was saying, that will end up in greater scale, which reduces cost. It promotes more innovation, and of course it creates more ability to use phones across carriers. Now, we obviously are not in total agreement on the Carterfone idea, because I think that the competition among different air interfaces in this country has actually served the country well. So there's, as with many things, there's pros and cons of every approach. Yes, there would be advantages to being able to take your phone anywhere. On the other hand, competition among air interfaces and technologies has been positive. And even in broadband, I think it likely will be positive. It very likely will end up with one air interface over time, but right now the competition between LTE and WiMAX is beneficial to everyone because each subsequent release of either technology has features and better speed and functions that the prior one didn't, and that creates the incentive for the other technology to match or best that release. So each release tends to be better and better, and I think there's a benefit for the consumer from that. But having said that, certainly on the 700 megahertz side of it, that would be the first major kind of core band that would not have, in effect, handsets or devices that can work across the band, depending on, again, the basic air interface. And it seems to us that the balkanization of the band that is occurring kind of under the FCC's radar, so to speak, through the working groups in the industry, with, in effect, a band class for almost every licensee, ultimately doesn't serve the public interest well. Thanks.
You're welcome. Joan?
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here today and for being able to offer a different perspective on this issue, and I will, in fact, offer a different perspective on this issue. We think about interoperability very different, and I'm going to take this back to a study that we recently commissioned to look at how mobile content is being consumed by U.S. wireless data consumers. We found that nearly half of all customers use 3 or more devices to access the same content, demonstrating that customers are clearly demanding open and interoperable access to content without regard to the device and without regard to the operating platform being used for delivery. And in that sense, we certainly agree the industry has much to do because both the application space and the OS space is very fragmented. And if we can accomplish greater interoperability, it could certainly be transformational. If you look back, history shows us that text messaging exploded once the industry developed interoperable standards that allowed messages to be delivered across platforms to users regardless of their device and regardless of their network. So AT&T certainly supports an open and seamless and interoperable wireless ecosystem, and we believe that will fuel the future of mobile broadband. But what some are advocating under the name of interoperability is really quite different. They're calling for very specific network and device regulatory mandates that we believe will simply limit operators' ability to offer devices that best meet their customers' needs and that maximize spectral efficiency, something extremely important with the scarce spectral resources out there. And we also believe that, quite frankly, it's produced broadband regulatory mandates in a marketplace where business-to-business roaming agreements were already commonplace. Now let me unpack both of those a little bit and look first at the device mandates. The suggestion is that we need regulatory mandates to require carriers like AT&T to, quote, to stop us from, quote, walling off our LTE network from customers of competitors. What do they allege the problem is? They allege that we do in fact plan to offer devices that will band to the spectrum that we have been licensed to use and that we will support in our network. Carriers have long offered devices that band to the spectrum that they deploy in their network and that they're licensed to use. Mandating us to put chipsets and devices that for spectrum that we are not licensed to use and that we will not deploy in our network is nonsensical. It would increase device cost and it would increase design complexity considerably in a world that is getting very complex on its own. Now, if such mandates were imposed, as been suggested here, exactly what band should the FCC target? The conversation here has been all about the 700 megahertz band, but that's not the only band being used in the LTE world. If Light Squared were sitting here, they might suggest that the FCC should target the MSSL band for mandated banding. They are building an LTE network in that band that will reach 260 million people by 2015. If Metro PCS were sitting here, they might want us all banned to PCS spectrum. That's where they are building their LTE networks, and I believe LEAP might be building in that space as well, although I'm not sure. Of course, Verizon Wireless is deploying in the upper 700 megahertz block, and even the suggestion that we're deploying only in the lower 700 megahertz block is wrong. We do not own 700 megahertz spectrum nationwide. Far from it. There are many, many markets out there where we don't own any 700 megahertz spectrum. In those markets, we will deploy an AWS spectrum. And of course, that completely doesn't even consider Sprint and Clearwire, who are deploying and spending billions of dollars to stand up a 4G WiMAX deployment in the 2.5 band. So if you're going to talk about an interoperable world out there, you really have to take into consideration all of these bands. And once you do, you realize how incredibly complex you're making any consideration about a device or a chipset manding requirement. Now, as to data roaming, I'll simply say we are currently providing carriers with commercial access to our 2G, our HSPA+, 3G broadband networks for the purposes of roaming. We have long provided commercial access to our data networks for roaming purposes. Our data roaming agreements date back to the earliest days of 2G data deployment. And within the last year, we made our 3G HSPA+ networks accessible to our roaming partners. If you look at the coverage maps that are available on almost every carrier's website, you can find clear evidence of widespread commercial broadband roaming arrangements. For this reason, we continue to believe that the recent broadband roaming mandate was not necessary, and it could, in fact, in some markets, disincent broadband deployment. Why build when you can roam? AT&T is committed to developing the world's most advanced mobile broadband network, a network that's open to innovation and that supports a broad array of devices. And we are dedicating billions of dollars to roll out LTE technologies while we are aggressively investing in cloud computing and other technologies to resolve some of the device and operating platform interoperability issues. But we do not support unnecessary regulatory mandates in this area. They will limit operator choice, and they will impede broadband investment. And such mandates, in the end, very often favor specific competitors and not competition. And they have no place in today's highly competitive mobile broadband environment. I'll stop there because I'm sure we'll get to more questions.
Very well. Stephen?
Hi. I'd like to thank Michael and the New America Foundation for having this event. I appreciate the invitation to be here. My name's Steve Berry. I'm the president and CEO of the Rural Cellular Association, the Competitive Carrier Association. And we represent almost 100 carriers, some of which you probably recognize, the names of which you recognize, some that you don't. You might recognize Metro PCS and US Cellular and Cell South. You may not recognize Windy City Cellular or Golden State Cellular or maybe even Bluegrass Cellular. But there's about 100 wireless carriers out there that are competitive carriers in the market today that have a very unique function, especially in the regional and rural markets. And we think it's very important to the health of the market, the wireless marketplace, that we continue to function. Now, Joan is very good and mentioned that it is a lot of facts and figures, and it's very complicated when you get down to the engineering. But the fundamental issue is that this is all about consumers. And it's all about the consumer experience. And it's all about jobs, and it's all about economic growth. And in rural America, you're not going to have the incentive to build out unless you have data roaming and interoperability. And we very much applaud the FCC's actions on data roaming. When you think about it, it's almost unconscionable that there could be another outcome, that a consumer expects their device to be used any place, anywhere they are, where there's a similar or compatible network that they can roam on. There's no technological reason why we can't respond to that. And I think the FCC got it right. And now we have a data roaming mandate that will enhance those roaming agreements that have been few and far between with the larger carriers. And now we move on to the next phase, which is interoperability. We did a study, the Rural Cellular Association. You can go to our website and find it, pull it down. It really focuses on data roaming and interoperability, and the economic impact that would bring to rural America in the creation of jobs and growth in the economies if you had both of those policy decisions. That's not a subsidy. It's not a requirement. It's not a huge regulatory triage. It's just a simple requirement of data roaming mandates that you agree to in private sector agreements, and interoperability, which is a reoccurrence of the old Reagan-era doctrine that said we should have interoperability when the CMRS spectrum was originally formed and we created the wireless industry. It worked. We have a competitive market. And it worked because they recognized that the larger carriers at the time would shut out any new innovators or any new entrants into the market if there wasn't an interoperability requirement. And I think it's done quite well. And that was the policy, essentially, that we followed in CMRS, and AWS, and PCS, and we thought it was going to be the policy that we would follow in 700 megahertz. But I digress. Hopefully we can have a discussion about the economic impact. Our study showed that in 19 states that have less than 90% mobile high-speed broadband penetration, you're going to create 117,000 jobs immediately over the first 3 years in those 19 states, and you're going to create a median income increase of a significant amount of money, is up to 5% in those rural states. That's a significant policy impact for just saying that, you should do what the consumers expect, and that is to have a device that operates on a network that is compatible in the area that the consumer lives, works, or plays. So hopefully we'll talk about economies of scale. We'll talk about interference. We'll talk about spectrum value. Without interoperability, I think you devalue the spectrum, which is a taxpayer hold asset that I think you'd like to see its value increase. We're certainly in a deficit right now, and everyone's looking to cut programs to bring more revenue to the table. Spectrum auctions, incentive auctions, it all works better, and it all makes the spectrum more valuable if it's interoperable. So hopefully we can talk about all those issues and the incentives that interoperability brings to rural America and my carriers, quite frankly, that have the revenue and have the capital and are ready to build out, and they need access to the handsets, the devices, and the networks that will actually allow consumers to have a better experience.
And you, Larry?
Well, thank you very much. Again, Michael, thank you very much for inviting me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Larry Spywak. I work at the Phoenix Center, and I write term papers for a living. This panel really is a loaded question. Free my phone. And we've talked about interoperability, and we've talked about data roaming, we've talked about handset subsidies. Before we get into the sausage making, let's take it from the 20,000-foot level and just talk about it, I guess, the best way, starting from a structural standpoint. Right? We all want vigorous competition. We want consumers to get both price competition, and we also want innovation. Right? We want quality competition. And that's a very tough thing that you have to balance. A lot of people have a sort of set in their mind, more firms equals more spectrum equals more firms equals more price. Well, here's what makes the telecom industry so different from most other industries is that it is characterized by extremely high fixed and sunk costs. I mean, literally, you put fiber in the ground, it is sunk, okay? Can't get it back. So we've done a lot of work on this, and think about it in this terms. There's an equilibrium number of firms in every market, right? An N number of firms. And that is determined by the intensity of price competition, the size of the market, the amount of fixed and sunk costs. So while we want a lot of price competition, we don't want it so much that you have a sort of race to the bottom and somebody goes bust. And if you have policies that encourage what I would describe as commoditization, you're going to have, by definition, increased industry concentration, right? If everybody's selling the exact same thing, you only really need one of it. And that's what happened, I think, when you saw the lower auction results from the C block. People accounted for lower profitability, and if you apply that, you're going to get increased concentration. So these are very, very complex topics. And so when we're talking about, for example, handsets, let me take a step back. So we've got this sort of general framework, and I think the FCC is starting to pick up on it. They talked about it a little bit. They cited our stuff in the National Broadband Plan in the last 14th CMRS report. So it's this balancing of price versus quality. And then we get to sort of handset subsidies and interoperability. So my first question is, if we want more innovation, why are we seeking for more commoditization? All right, you get back to that point, because regulation is not costless. Somebody is going to have to pay for it. Somebody's going to have to pay for these networks. And so if you can't, depend on where you extract the money for that, it could end up, and if you prohibit it, for example, in the net neutrality rules, you can't get it from the upstream market. It's all going to come out of consumers. So then you've got the handset subsidy, which sort of just leave off with this, but this is just, I guess, one of the focus. People like in America cheap, subsidized phones. They don't want to spend $600 on a phone. So if you say, oh no, we've got to have an interoperable network, first off, that not only goes to mandates the same standard, and I remember, just as a quick footnote here, a friend of mine was the general counsel of VoiceStream, which was the predecessor of T-Mobile, and this is like 12 years ago. You know, if you think the government can do stuff dispassionately, he was complaining because the CDMA folks had hired all Al Gore and all of the ex-Clinton people to lobby for the government to mandate CDMA as the next generation standard, and then he would have to spend billions of dollars to upgrade his network to meet that. So again, it's not costless. So you've got just the standard, and then it's the radios, right? You know, if you're trying to build out a 4G network or whatever we're calling out LTE, and we're trying to get spectrum from all these different places, you're going to build out to try and get your network to accommodate all with the spectrum in your portfolio. The government has never said build out everything, because why? You'd have a brick of a phone and it would cost a fortune. But now we go, okay, we've got handset subsidies, and I don't like to use the word subsidies. They are ways of reducing churn. In exchange, you can go out, go in the Apple store, go on eBay, buy a phone, unlock phone, and go buy service. Nobody cares. But it's a way of attracting customers. Why? Because they are perfect complements. And if you get rid of that, what's going to happen? Price of the service isn't going to go down, but the price of phone's going to go up. And I would commend you to read. We did a whole economic analysis of this. And just to sort of leave off for the discussion, I'm perusing through the Consumer Reports survey here, and I noticed that two questions are not asked. First off, would you pay $600 for a phone? And B, it all talks about your existing phone. Well, what about the next generation of phone? So all these things have consequences that we need to weigh out very, very carefully in terms of what we want to accomplish. And I think that's where we need to start having the debate, is what is it that we want to do? And we're not having that debate.
Thank you. I thought I'd start with, I brought exactly one prop, and of course it's a phone. One of the things that gets discussed a lot when we talk about these issues of compatibility and interoperability is right now we have phones that are, you know, carefully designed and tested to work right in a carrier's network. This used to be a standard Android phone from Sprint. At some point, HTC decided we're done updating the software on it. So it's now running a third-party ROM that Sprint didn't test. Has no oversight on. There's all sorts of apps I can put on it. I've got the wireless tether one for free wireless tethering. Sorry. There's a neat app that blows up the nearest tower. So, and I know this is not, you know, putting third-party builds of Android on your phone is not for everyone, but I know I'm not the only one to have done it. So, is this a problem for the wireless industry? The specter of rogue phones?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer it. But you know, I'm delighted that you've been able to take our phone and do what you want to do with it and be happy. And we, of course, have a long history of an open source platform and developer cooperation, so that applications and different ideas and different access can get to our phones quickly. You know, you can go anywhere on the net you want to go on our phones, and we've always supported that. Obviously, network stability and the stability of the phone is important, and when you put on a third-party platform, operating platform, we, of course, don't know exactly what it does, and someone on the bleeding edge of this, such as yourself, can maybe handle that. The average user probably cannot. So I'm sure that's something that if our handset people were here would say, gee, we want to know more about that, we want to look at it, you know, maybe we could test it and see if it's all right. You know, I would say the following. The thing that just jumps out at me from that, other than the precise question Rob raised, is as more and more broadband is deployed, the spectrum is getting more and more congested. Blocks of spectrum that really weren't being used intensively, such as 700 megahertz once the TV was taken off, or the mobile satellite bands, or 2.5, all of them, and the L band and also the MSS bands at 2 gigahertz. The more they're used, the more interference problems are going to occur, because equipment has been designed in the environment that existed at the time rather than the future environment with more users operating on adjacent spectrum. So to the extent that your phone begins to operate in a way different than it was designed to do, could it cause operational changes, for example, in power control and frequency stability that could exacerbate interference problems? And of course, the number one thing none of us want is for the phone not to work and or to cause problems to other users of the network or other networks. So I don't know if this could implicate that, but that's one thing I'd be concerned about.
I've got this app that actually blows up the nearest cell tower if I'm in a bad mood.
That could work.
Okay.
No interference then.
I guess we should ask the other carrier here what your thoughts are on.
Well, I don't disagree with many of the things that Larry just said. I think it's a problem in that customers expect to get a device that's going to work. And when they get a wireless device, it's sort of different than getting a desktop, where everybody understands that they're responsible for maintaining virus software and managing downloads. When they get a wireless device, they really expect it to be fully functional and working, and they do not expect to be troubled by viruses or other things that might interfere with the experience. So when you do something like you did, Rob, and I agree with Larry, I don't think there's many of our users who could accomplish that, we can no longer promise the reliability. And that's why we work closely with our device partners and our application partners to ensure things are going to work very well for our customers and they'll have a good experience. I'd say the other thing that could be a real problem, and we've seen some carriers have this problem, and I actually wrote a blog on it, apps can attack. I mean, when you get a really bad app, there's a carrier out there, and an app was being downloaded onto the devices, and it was constantly pinging the network for, I believe it was location information or something like that. So it was sucking up an enormous amount of capacity off the network, and the users weren't even aware of it. It's not like even when they weren't using the app, it was pinging away. So, and I agree with Larry, in an environment where we are restrained from a spectrum resource perspective, we have to be using that capacity smartly, and very often you can have apps that aren't very smart at all. And we're working a lot with developers and other folks to make sure the apps are smarter in terms of how they use capacity on the network.
I totally agree with both comments. I think what you're on the cutting edge of the techno geniuses that are
I should have
modified.
worn my propeller head hat.
When I was growing up, what you built is a street machine. You took a regular late model Ford and put AFB 4 barrels on it and a new rear end and headers and bored and stroked it. And if you get caught going over the speed limit because you could go a lot faster, you're going to pay a price. And I think what they're talking about is the price that you pay. And the price you pay is you get worse performance on their network. And I think if you're talking about something that tears the road up, in this case the network, or somehow or another disenfranchises others' ability, then I think you've gone overboard. And I hope we don't have a whole lot of those devices being put on their networks.
I mean, I guess ultimately our position is that consumers should be able to have access to the applications and the services that they want, and for us that's a good idea. Consumers should be able to decide what they would like, what they wouldn't like, and so our preference is to have a more open ecosystem than an ecosystem where the carriers are deciding which applications and services our consumers are able to put on their phones.
I'd just like to congratulate you for conceding that you are, in fact, a negative network externality.
It's not usually how I think of myself.
This is exactly sort of the debate. I mean, this is not for, I think the carriers called it better. It's like, I'm going to take my phone and hack it and all of a sudden expect it to work. And there was just a piece I just saw somebody email me before this conference where China's having a huge problem of just these open platforms and just viruses getting into the network, and that would be bad. So I think that it's not something that you can just take a hot rod and soup up or get a chopper or something like that. This is this shared use, and people need to be responsible, which gets to the point of, do we really want a market where consumers, I think carriers would ultimately prefer it. It's like, I don't want to take care of this. And you just look at it with your home computer where, Windows breaks, and then Windows calls up and says, no, it's a Norton's problem, call them up. No, it's a Dell problem, and you're on the phone for 9 hours, and you have to spend $50 every time to talk to a help desk. I mean, if that's the world we want to move to, fine. I don't think that's what consumers want.
I would just note my Mac at home is pretty straightforward. I haven't had to call anyone for help with that. Let's get to the issue that Steve brought up before. When we had analog cellular, there was an interoperability mandate. Now, granted, back then at the start there wasn't much to compete on. This phone weighed 2 pounds. This one weighed 1.9 pounds. But at some point we decided we were not going to do that. We were not going to mandate one digital wireless technology, which is different from how a lot of other countries, went about this. Let's sort of talk about the benefits and costs for customers and for carriers, and certainly small and regional ones. It's not how most other countries have done it. What do we do right? What do we do wrong?
Well, and let me kick it off. You're right. It was a different time, but I think it really set a realistic precedent to ensure some competitive guidelines. And I don't think we're that different now in the need to ensure that there is a competitive marketplace. You also had a different context of the marketplace. I mean, 10 years ago, most of the carriers were fairly similar in size. I mean, 10 years ago, AT&T, as we know it now, didn't exist. Singular, Verizon. I mean, there were less than 25 million customers on the Verizon AT&T network individually. You had a huge tier 2 repository of ecosystem developers, as well as ability to data roam. I mean, not to roam, voice roam, and create economies of scale in acquiring handsets. We're moving away from that. Now you have very closely getting into a duopoly, and you have a huge market dominance by 2 carriers. And I don't think the trend is going to particularly improve the competitive juices at the for the consumer. But so I don't think it's unreasonable, and there's plenty. I've got plenty of examples. Not only the Carterfone, but before that was the Hushaphone, and you have plenty of 629 provisions, which you had interoperable sets for the cable industry. I mean, there's nothing new here in terms of the FCC making a decision to have interoperable devices. And what we're not we're not talking about interoperable devices between and among non-operable standards. We're talking about within the CDMA standard, within the GSM standard, and that's a subset that we've allowed the carriers to make those decisions. And the 3GPP and some of those other standard setting bodies have allowed that innovation within the standards of the sub technologies. What I'm more concerned about is that the real innovative process that AT&T and Verizon have engaged in the 700 megahertz is that you've uniquely qualified your particular band so that it's a private band, and you've taken actions directly to inhibit a competitive carrier from being able to access devices that they could put on their network. So it's not that we're mandating standards within the CDMA or the GSM or HSPA or LTE. It's the substandards within that technology is allowing certain carriers to and those that have dominance to essentially create their own little fiefdom, their own little fortress that you can't penetrate, and the consumer pays the price.
So a copper network should run identically the way a cable network works, right?
No, they don't run exactly the same, but if you notice that in Europe they're doing really unusual things with copper now that they said they couldn't do 10 years ago.
And so are the companies here. I mean you got to. There's 2 different things on the issue here. I mean, first off, let's talk about the size and scale issue in a moment, because that's a whole other thing. But the FCC has never gotten in, aside from standard technical interfaces, which they were correct. I mean, a CDMA network will talk to a GSM network. If I call you up, I'm an AT&T caller, and I call somebody on Verizon, oh my goodness, it works. The traffic goes through. That's not what we're talking about here. Okay, standard setting is an extremely complex problem. The FCC is going through this whole debacle right now on set-top boxes, because a lot of these phone functionalities is not just in the phone, it's in the network as well. And why is it we want commoditization and homogenization when product differentiation is a really important factor, particularly in a concentrated industry characterized by high fixed and sunk cost? Okay, we don't want just one. Let's just have a monopoly and call it quits and just have a perpetual resale model. You want that differentiation. And if you're thinking that the FCC is a neutral place where we can sit and have a discussion of let's get into standard setting, even the FCC's conceded we can't do it. I mean, when I did my book about 10 years ago, I found the FCC actually had a regulatory proceeding which lasted over a year of the standard RJ11 phone plug. Okay? Look, it was hilarious, but they did this. And you're thinking, and again, I go back to my voice stream analogy, that you think that this can be dispassionate and people are going to be arguing over what standard to be set is laughable, because it's the epitome of sausage making. So, but putting that aside, we want that differentiation. It is a good thing. Now let's talk about the scale and scope, which is completely irrelevant to what kind of technical standard we want to do. And that's not even talking about building out the network to accommodate the spectrum. Issues of scale and scope have been plaguing this business forever, and also the build or buy decision. You've had it with intercarrier compensation for years, right? What's the first rule of telecom? How do you make money? I terminate more calls on your network than you do on mine. You settle it up, have a nice day. Okay, that's how it works. And so everybody's always argued, well, I'm a peer, I shouldn't have to pay, right? Because you're going to have an interconnection rate of gazillion dollars. If the traffic's the same, who cares? And so I'm not a peer, which is why if we were to do a Title II approach, and I'm not proud of my rate-making background, but I have one, having litigated rate cases, the standard is similarly situated. When we talk about undue discrimination, you got a J&R standard, which means it's got to fall within the zone of reasonableness, right? It can't be creamy returns on one side, excessive monopoly rates, and it can't be confiscatory. But then you got the undue discrimination part, which means you can have discrimination, it just can't be undue. And undue means you have to treat similarly situated customers the same. And if you have somebody who has a lot of traffic and somebody who doesn't have has less traffic, they're not the same. And this fight has been going on. I had lunch this week with a commissioner, state commissioner, who's very upset because rural guys aren't getting the same programming contracts that the bigger guys are doing because they don't have the scale and scope and they're not getting it. This is a fundamental problem. So, but what you're having then this isn't a market failure, this is a quibbling over rents. So there's a very difference between those 2 points.
Going back to the point of the AMPS nationwide standard in 1980s. In the 1980s, the wireless industry was in its infancy. It was just emerging, and they were trying to attract capital for investment and build out. That wireless industry looks absolutely nothing like the wireless industry that we have today. Even though AMPS was anointed a nationwide standard, they did not anoint a standard beyond that, and we still saw enormous investment. So some carriers chose GSM, some carriers chose CDMA, and off we were the races to the 2G investment. For the 3G world, people did upgrades either in the HSPA UMTS track or the EVDO track. Again, billions of dollars of investment, choice for consumers, innovation, new devices, better services, all without a nationwide standard. Now, as we move toward the 4G, I can't think of a worse time to try to impose new nationwide standards. We already have enormous commitment from multiple carriers for the LTE standard, but even that I don't think should be adopted, because then that would strand billions of dollars of investment by carriers who invested on the WiMAX side of the house. Choice and flexibility here has driven investment. It has demonstrated that the FCC's refusal to step in here to set standards when they weren't not necessary was the right choice, and I would hope that we would continue to see caution in this area as we move forward, given the investment and innovation that's going on in the wireless space.
I agree with that the FCC has made some good decisions on not standardizing the basic air interface, but I think my colleague here, with all due deference, has also made the case why the proposed merger of AT&T and T-Mobile should not be approved, why it should be stopped. Because as a result of that merger, and certainly AT&T has every right to propose it and pursue it, but that merger will result in commoditization. That merger will result in a market structure in which there are two carriers who so far overshadow everyone else in terms of revenue, in terms of subscribers, in terms of scale, in terms of the ability to go to vendors and get equipment at amazing scale, that the ability to really see the competition that has created that innovation, to have multiple air interfaces, to have them jump each other and to evolve and to give us more innovation, more choices, lower costs, more minutes, data capability, messaging, things we never even imagined, that will go away or be severely retarded. So the logical extension of what the FCC hasn't done in some cases is to create a situation where our marketplace, our industry is going to drive to consolidation. And the role of the regulator here needs to be setting the boundaries, setting the overall framework for competition to be enduring. Because without that, competition tends not to be enduring. And I think that's why, while everything we've been talking about is extremely important, the overriding issue that kind of goes over all of those things and will occupy, I think, all of us much of the next year is the proposal for further consolidation.
Can I would like to jump in here. Thank you.
Thank you.
It sounds like everyone here agrees that there should be choice, there should be flexibility, and there should be competition. And, the way we just look at it in a different way. We've seen from our survey that consumers do want the flexibility of taking their devices from one network to another. And the way we get there, we think, and the best way to get there is for there to be interoperability. I think this allows for flexibility for consumers to decide which phones they want and where they want to take their phones. And so, I think a lot of, there's a lot of discussion here, and Larry throws out a lot of great words like commoditization and things like that. But at the end of the day, if the market and the device market is able to evolve where there's more openness and where consumers have choices with where they want to take their phones, we don't know that's going to end up with a $600 phone. I mean, it's easy to say now that a phone is going to be $600 and do consumers want a $600 phone. But if you let the market evolve, if device manufacturers are competing with each other based on their devices, then you don't know how much the phone is going to cost. And so, I think it's easy to say that consumers don't want to buy expensive phones, but we don't know if in a competitive marketplace, if the market evolves, how much those phones will be and whether or not consumers would like a subsidized phone, and that's a choice that they want, or whether they want to go elsewhere and buy their own phone. And so I think interoperability ultimately is important to ensure that consumers have flexibility and choice.
I want to talk about the most, obvious case of an interoperability impediment, which is these days if you have a GSM phone, in theory you should be able to use that on any other carrier if it supports the same bands. Just swap out the SIM card, except some phones have their SIM card slots locked. So if you buy an iPhone from AT&T or Apple, it is married till death do us part to AT&T, unless you jailbreak it and unlock it, which is a lot more difficult than putting a third-party ROM on your Android phone. You may also find on other AT&T phones, I think it's once you're out of contract, you can get it unlocked, or are there provisions if you're going out of the country to get it unlocked sooner? Mm-hmm. T-Mobile, on the other hand, I think it's just a 40-day wait to unlock. I don't know. I would assume you're not buying T-Mobile to adopt their policies in that respect. Let's talk about that. To what extent, at what point does a continued SIM lock become something that ought to be the subject of some sort of oversight or regulation or none at all?
Never.
I thought you'd say that.
Look, the SIM issue is all wrapped up with the price point at which we make devices available to our customers. When the iPhone was originally introduced, if you went overseas and you bought it from a carrier over there without a subsidy, you would pay $600. If you bought it from us, you would pay $199. The rest of that cost didn't disappear. AT&T paid it with shareholder value. I think in the first year, the estimate was about $1 billion worth of shareholder value, supported our customers' purchase of those devices. Those devices transformed our customers' experience with our network. It transformed the way they communicate and the entertainment they were able to get access to, the educational information they were able to get access to, and quite frankly, it transformed the industry. So we believe that it was a very good move on our part. Our customers loved access to that device at $199. By the way, you can now get an Apple 3GS for $49.99. You can get it refurbed for $19.99. So you can put this incredible computing device in your pocket for $19.99. Obviously, we made an investment in those devices to put them out there in the marketplace, and locking the SIM chip for the period of the contract ensured that we would then get return on that investment. So I think that the marketplace is working. If customers want an unlocked device, they can buy it. As long as they have that choice, I don't think there's any need for regulatory intervention into the space.
Just two things to clarify. But the iPhone SIM remains locked even after you're out of the contract. And if you bought an iPhone at the no contract price, it would still be locked, correct?
Well, the iPhone SIM is a little bit different because, as you indicated, it's integrated into the device. So it's not the SIM card that you can switch out.
No, it's got a regular SIM card.
But it's like you said, it's not a normal consumer can switch a SIM card out of a regular GSM device fairly easily.
Yeah, there's a little paperclip whole thingy on the top of it. I've done it. Why don't we let someone else get in on this?
You can put a my friend actually designs handsets. Took his daughter, took a prepaid card and stuck it in an iPhone. You don't get the integrated network voicemail functions, and you don't get the data functions, but you got Wi-Fi and all the other stuff. I mean, you can do that, and the voice works fine. A couple points. Commoditization is not concentration. There's a big difference between the two. Okay, we have cable against wireline. I mean, as my partner said, if you would have told me when I was a staffer back in the 90s at the FCC, we would have had 2 wireline firms, we would have thrown a party, right? And you certainly see them compete on both price, quality, and maybe somebody might even show up at your house when you make an appointment now. That's all part of competition. So this notion that you have a concentrated market that you don't have product differentiation is ridiculous. And then you still get back to it's the cost of the phone. I think Joan went into that. This market is workably competitive. Okay, I'm not going to say it's highly competitive. I'm not going to say it's super, because the data. You can choose between 3 or 4 or possibly more with MVNOs. That's pretty darn good. You're not going to get perfect competition in this business, and you're not going to get perfect competition in a lot of businesses because of high fixed and sunk costs, right? So we've already seen what consumers are willing to do. If you start raising the handset, this is a perfect complement to the wireless service. It doesn't exist but for the fact of the wireless service. If you start interfering in that relationship, the price of this is going to go up. That's basic economics. That's it.
Larry, Parole, Steve? Or I should say other Larry.
I mean, I think what we've seen with the iPhone is that you're stuck with one service provider. And I think the point here, again, to go back to, I guess, why we're here is, should consumers have the flexibility to take their phone with them regardless of who their provider is? And I think, we've seen with AT&T, you could buy the iPhone, but you could only use it with one service, with the AT&T service. You had to go through hoops to make it work on the T-Mobile service, but the way the phone worked was you could only use it with AT&T. And so, I'm just trying to get back to the point that why we're here as to what do consumers want and what's the best way to ensure that consumers have a flexible market and have the market where they can buy the devices of their choices and they can take their phones with them wherever they want. And we continue to believe that interoperability is the way to go for this. I think there's obviously debate over whether or not it's technically feasible and the cost of it, but from what we've seen, we think it's the right way to go. It's worked before, and there's no reason that we can see that it can't work in the future.
Well, I guess I would just draw a bit of a distinction. I mean, I think where it worked before, you basically had one essential air interface. You had an analog cellular world, but once the Commission did not impose a digital standard and you've had the development of competing air interfaces. I mean, I agree with the comments earlier that if you were to build a phone that would work on every band and every air interface, it would be bulky and not a very good form factor. It would suck down battery, and I think it would not perform very well, and I think most people wouldn't be happy with it, and they'd say, why am I paying for all the things I'm not using? So, I think that would be going a step too far. Now, having the ability on a phone within a commercial band to operate across the band, as we've argued at 700, I think is a different issue, and one that's far more feasible, doesn't impose the penalties and difficulties, and may address some of the concerns that Parole is talking about. But I do think it eventually does come down in large part to what does the consumer want. If you're going to be able to take your phone wherever you go, then it would have to be priced like any other product that you take wherever you go. And the question is the subsidy model that has become the prevailing approach in this country the right way to go as we move into smartphones so intensively in the future, or is there another model? Before the merger at Nextel, our 4G thinking was really along the lines of devices that would have the WiMAX chipset in it, whether it was a camera or anything else or a phone, and you would not sell it on an effective subsidized basis. You would sell it at a reasonable cost, and then you could choose to use it, buy the drink, so to speak, or however much you wanted on a WiMAX network, or you could sign up. You could do any one of those models you wanted, and it would be up to the consumer. Now, interestingly, that thinking in 2003, 2004 is not the way it's turned out so far. And certainly we haven't seen a demand for devices at the full cost. Plus, I think the nature of devices, broadband devices, is probably a lot more complex and a lot more capabilities than maybe the thinking we had back in those years. So, again, this is an evolving area, but I think it does come down a lot of ways to what does the consumer want, because in a competitive marketplace, we're all going to try to do what the consumer wants, and the goal, again, is to maintain a very competitive marketplace.
So I just want to clarify, I am talking about interoperability within the 700 megahertz
Okay.
band. And, I think the point, and I think this is what you were alluding to, is that, the customer should decide. I don't think interoperability mandates that there should be no subsidized phones anymore, that you shouldn't subsidize phones. But I think it allows the market to evolve in a way where maybe you go back to, or you go to a situation where consumers think that it's better just to buy their phone in the open market and take it to the service provider of their choice. But I think that market has no problem.
Let me just address that, and I mean, what I don't exactly understand what you're saying about the $600 phone, Larry, because that's about what they cost, and it's the subsidies that make them, less. There are programs right now where you buy the $600 phone, and by doing that, you get a lower plan. You pay less money. You buy the phone up front. But if you have an interoperability policy that ensures that phone cannot operate on any other network, and it's not because of the lack of the technology, it's because the overt actions of a carrier that says we're going to lock it up, or we're going to disable it, or we're going to put software in there that does not allow that device to go to someplace else, then I think you've really changed the definition of what you bought. I mean, what did the consumer buy? If they paid $600 for it, should they get an open phone that they can take to any other comparable network and use it? Or if they subsidize the phone, does that mean that phone is, even after they pay the 2 years and they pay the full amount, that it's worthless on any other carrier, so they essentially bought something that they can't go to another carrier with? I think it is the consumer experience, and I think it is what the consumers expect. But the consumers, they have no idea how complex it is to build one of those phones that do all that. And I think that's where there's a basic fundamental policy that the FCC should ensure that, to the extent that you can have interoperability among the paired 700 megahertz and devices that operate on them, then that is a plus for the consumers. It's a plus for everyone in the marketplace, especially the competitive carriers that don't mind having to take a refurbished phone or a phone that came from someplace else and download their software to make it work on their network. I mean, it seems to me that when you buy the phone, if you're the consumer, you expect, after that contract is over, to actually own something and have some choices. And I think that's maybe what you're talking about, more on interoperability.
But again, I would say, why are we stopping at the 700 megahertz network? So if you're a consumer and you buy a phone and it operates on the A-band,
and we're
with
not.
one of your carriers,
we're not. AWS has interoperable devices within the AWS, and so does PCS.
If they are buying a device and it operates on the A-band, where some of your members are building their network after 2-year contract, what if they want to go to Light Squared, which is building a very large, aggressive LTE build-out? I'm quite confident your members are not putting in MSS L-band chips into their devices, and I would not expect them to. It would make no economic sense for them to do it. They are going to serve their customers with their licenses, the A-block customers. They have the right to put whatever chipset they want into a device. They can work with device manufacturers to do that. But they would not want to be mandated to deploy an MSS L-band 4G LTE chip in that device to ensure that those customers can take that device after 2 years to Light Squared. I'm pretty confident they would resist that mandate, in the same way we don't want to be mandated what we ban to.
Well, Light Squared is putting a device together, in my understanding, that has a band 12 in it. But it doesn't mean that you can't change the chip or the chipset or the SIM card. I mean, what you're designing is something that is not usable after use on your network. And I'm saying that there's no technological reason why you can't have interoperability, why that could not be the standard within a band. And if it's 700, if it's AWS or PCS or 1.6 or 2.5.
But this is the analog equivalent of telling Burger King they have to sell both Coke and Pepsi.
No, it's
yeah, it is.
No,
I can only buy Kirkland products at Costco. I can't get it at Sam's Club. I mean, these type of arrangements happen in every commercial market, okay? Because the product differentiation, there is no lack of choice for phones. Can I get an iPhone? Now I can get it on 2 places. Everywhere? No, but you know what? That whole thing drove the whole droid revolution, and that's the mother of invention. That's why we have a patent system. Okay?
That's right. And that Kirkland device, that the Kirkland product is, in many cases, is made in the same factory or the same, production facility that Giant or somebody else buys from, and they can buy from it. Our guys can't buy from them. Our guys can't buy from the OEM that is building the product because the entire product is bought up by the carrier that has the dominant position for a 2-year period of time. You can't even get that product.
It's product differentiation. And if I'm a rural carrier, I mean, you have a choice in handsets. Is it the best and brightest? No. But I mean, that's the way markets work. But the problem is, let's boil this back down because I know we're running short of time. Regulation is not costless. If the government starts getting involved, and let's bring it back to this core point of mandating interoperability, mandating things, those costs are going to have to be incurred by someone, and those someone are end consumers. So if we we can see prices rise. So we need to be very careful about how we allocate costs, because this isn't just a fight about people who are big and bad and located in Kansas or New Jersey or Texas. These things have real effect on consumer prices and their choices and their innovation and their devices. That's what this whole debate is. People are forgetting. This is not a costless exercise.
And I totally agree. But under those, should the FCC have a HAC compliance, hearing aid compatibility compliance standards? Should we have interoperability with band 14 in the public safety so that everyone can actually get access to the public safety network? I mean, those are also things that cost. And I'm just saying that along the same lines, there is a requirement, I believe, in this.
Public safety is going to build to their network. That's how you build a network. You build whatever.
And I think public safety would like to have interoperability with networks above and beyond the small little slice of spectrum that they currently have.
And I think, Larry, what you're maybe not giving equal weight to is this is not just a market-driven industry. This is a regulated industry. Why? Because
it's regulated. I'm shocked.
Well, listening to you would think maybe not, but there are two reasons why. One, first and foremost in wireless, is to prevent interference. That's the raison d'etre of the FCC. And the second one is to promote the public interest. So, for example, when Steve says, why shouldn't public safety be able to get devices that would work not just on band class 14, but on other spectrum at 700, assuming that they want to work out arrangements and other carriers are willing to do it, why shouldn't they have the scale and scope of that? Because the end result of where we're headed at 700 is public safety, for example, will continue to be buying a one-off, high-priced device that only works on a limited amount of spectrum and will not have the scale and the innovation and the lower cost that particular industry should have and that community should have. Now, that's maybe not a pure market result, but again, that's not a pure market issue. That's a public interest issue.
Exactly.
And that's why the balkanization of 700 is particularly offensive, is because the government, Congress on down, has decided this is going to be the new home for broadband public safety. We're going to put it there. We're going to potentially give them double the spectrum now for it, not to mention the narrow band that should be made more flexible so it could be added to it as well. And yet then we're going to confine how they use it rather than allowing them to have many choices. Public safety is best served by having the maximum number of opportunities to work with commercial carriers to leverage the amazing investment that commercial carriers are making in the broadband world, whether it's with Jones Carrier or our carrier or some other carrier through leases, hosting, excess capacity, whatever the D block and all of those issues result. But balkanizing the band prevents that, and that's not in the public interest, and that's why, while I'm a strong believer in the marketplace, how can I not be, having worked for a carrier that helped define it? There are places where the public interest has to control, and I think that's one of them. And the other one overall, as I said earlier, is maintaining a competitive marketplace so that the benefits that we've all talked about of the last 15 years of competition, that we continue to accrue them and give the customer more of the things that the customer will be amazed by.
At this point, I want to have some interoperability with the audience. I have more questions here, but I think you all might have some as well. So is there a mic floating around, or should you just talk really loud? Good. Of course, name, affiliation, etc.
Tim Ayers Associates, very clever name. Are there any international models on this in other countries in terms of interoperability? Does anybody know?
I am not aware of any. I am aware that when you're talking about 4G deployment, LTE 4G deployment, which is becoming pretty much the technology of choice worldwide, it is becoming increasingly fragmented. So these band classes, which have been called proprietary to AT&T, are not. They're developed through a standards process here in the United States as well as abroad. All carriers and other people interested in the space participate in these standards processes. They're quite open. The purpose of it is to define band classes that will be most effective for the delivery of service. And if you count the number of band classes developing across the globe to support LTE services, it's well over 20. I think it's 20 to 25 at this point. And again, this goes to my point of this is becoming a very complicated world where there's a lot of different bands being relied on by carriers to deploy LTE services. And we really need to give carriers the flexibility, particularly when they partner with their manufacturing partners and work through the design issues. We need to give them the flexibility to determine how to best serve their customers and how to try to fit all of that electronics into a device while keeping it small, while keeping it affordable, and while making sure there's some decent battery life. Because the more you load in there, it gets bigger, it gets more expensive, and the battery life shortens. So all there is to it, it's plain physics.
I mean, I'm not aware of what's going on internationally, but I do know that in interviews, the head of AT&T has suggested overseas that an interoperable environment is necessary and is a good thing. And so it sounds to me that, overseas AT&T has supported an interoperable environment. And so I think that's the way that it should be going.
Can I just correct that? Are you referring to Randall Stevenson's comments in Barcelona? Okay, again, this has been misinterpreted, and it goes back to my opening comments. What he talked about is the ecosystem and the fragmentation in application stores and in OS platforms. And the need for the industry, not governments and not regulators, the need for the industry to get together and determine how we can address those issues with interoperable standards that would allow content to be delivered seamlessly across platforms and across devices. He certainly was not suggesting device mandates internationally, and I feel like I needed to correct that.
I think just to add to kind of what's been said just now, I think what it really comes down to, and the international model, of course, is varied right now. There are actually quite a bit of WiMAX deployment around the world. In fact, more WiMAX than LTE, but in the United States, LTE is obviously going to be the dominant standard. But I think the band class issue becomes one of really, it's carrier driven, but it becomes what's best for a carrier. Each carrier pursues its own interests in the band class discussions. And I think you have carriers who have decided it makes a lot of sense for the band class to be defined to only their spectrum. And you have other carriers, typically smaller carriers, who say, no, that's going to hurt me, that's going to hurt my ability to go to a manufacturer and buy in bulk and get any kind of scale. And if you can't get scale, you can't compete. Because if you can't get your prices competitive, you can't compete. So this becomes very fundamental. It looks like it's not, but it becomes very fundamental when it gets down to how do we really maintain a competitive environment.
And I mean, Joan's right. The process is ostensibly open. If you have a team of engineers that you're willing to pay to go to Turkey, to New Zealand, to China, to Japan, and maintain your best interest at the 3GPP when they're setting the standards. For most of the smaller carriers that I represent, that was not an issue that they had always realized they had to involve themselves in. But a small group of them got together, and they sent those team of individuals to all those foreign places when the world would sit down and talk about engineering standards. Before, only the largest of the carriers would go. And yes, the smaller carriers benefited from standards that were, in fact, turned out to be interoperable. And there is now Band 12 because of what they did. I think we realized there were going to have to be more and more involved. And my hat's off to the FCC. For the first time, they sent their chief engineer to one of these standard-setting bodies that set standards for all the spectrum that they sell. So you had U.S. taxpayer spectrum being sold at auction in the United States, and an independent body, standard-setting body, foreign U.S.-based body that's a bunch of manufacturers and engineers setting the standards for the utilization of the spectrum which the U.S. sold, and we didn't even know anything about it. But my hat's off. The FCC is now at those meetings, and they'll at least know some of the decisions that they're making at those standard-setting bodies will impact the cost and the value of spectrum that they're trying to put on the market.
see we have a question. Michael, I think your name is.
That's right, again, from New America, of course. And actually, as one preface I was realizing is, if some people don't know the, we're throwing around in the 700 band, the band 12, band 14. Hopefully you picked up that colored picture of the diagram of the 700 band, but it's on the table when you leave if you're wondering what the treasure map looks like. So my question, Larry Kriever mentioned earlier that Sprint's original thinking was that consumers might buy, the device and the WiMAX separately. So I'd like to ask Joan and and the others if that isn't the answer to part of this problem, or at least to the issue of, say, the SIM lock and the ability of carriers to recoup what you're calling a subsidy, while allowing consumers to take their device between carriers. And the reason I ask is, for example, in any other context, right? If I go to General Electric, if I buy a washing machine or a refrigerator for $600, right, and I only put $200 down, nobody calls it a subsidy. I still have to pay the other $400, and so does the smartphone buyer eventually pay it. But it's transparent as an installment contract, so that even if and it doesn't limit my ability to use that refrigerator on Pepco. I don't have to use a certain electricity provider because I bought my refrigerator from GE. So but I've got an installment contract then, and if I go somewhere else, I still have to pay it. So I'm wondering if part of the answer is to simply separate the purchase of the device from the purchase of the service, so that people know what they're paying for. And yeah, I mean, Americans love to not have to pay things up front. But if they could see in their bill each month that they're paying $20, the installment purchase is $20 a month for the device for 2 years, and the service is another $40, then even if they switch services, they still have to pay off their device, just like I have to pay off my refrigerator. So I'm wondering if that isn't part of the answer.
I guess I would observe that a wireless device is not a washing machine. You can plug a washing machine into any electric outlet in this country and make it run. When you pick up a wireless device, it has to talk to a network, and it will talk to the network over specific bands. And how it operates will depend on what bands are supported in that device. And I think, as we've talked to today, if you want the device to work in 4G and you wanted it to talk to every possible band out there, you'd have to load it up. Well, first you'd have to choose LTE over WiMAX. You'd have to choose a technology platform. I don't think you can dual band both, but I think Sprint's experimenting with some of that, but I don't think it's possible yet. So let's say you choose LTE, so you got to band it up with 700, upper and lower. You got to band it up with 1900. You got to band it up with AWS, MSS L band, and probably 850. I think some carriers are probably, U.S. Cellular's announced an LTE deployment plan. I'm assuming that's an 850. Then what's the device going to be backward compatible to? Because 4G networks aren't fully deployed. So when you move outside a 4G footprint, you got to talk to a 3G network. So is it going to have CDMA technology in it or GSM technology? And once you choose that technology choice, then you got to figure out what bands, 850 or 1900 or any other specific band out there. And then you got to figure out, if you're going to take the device out of the country, how's it going to roam? Because there's roaming partners too. So I think the comparing the wireless device to a washing machine is a very, very bad comparison. The electronics that are in these devices are so complicated, and the design is getting so complicated that it's unrealistic to expect that a device will simply be able to walk out of a store and be pulled out of a box and just talk to the nearest network. It's just not going to happen. Now, unless it works on Wi-Fi. There's certainly Wi-Fi compatibility, and there's Wi-Fi standards, and many devices are now Wi-Fi compliant. So there's opportunities there, but there's not opportunities broadly across the entire range of spectrum being used for LTE deployments.
When I was listening to John, I felt like the guy at the carnival, sits down, he says, he puts this P underneath the nuts and said, just keep watching it, and at the end I'll ask you which one to choose. That's not exactly correct. What we're talking about is interoperability within a paired 700 megahertz, or interoperability within the same band that you have, within the same technology that you have within that band. You can put as much as 6 to 12 radio bands in a chip right now. So half of the ones you talked about, in fact. And what is Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi is exactly that, and they figured out a way to make that work. Now, we're talking about something a little different than having to pack in 15, 20 different bands, because you talked about spectrum is everywhere from 700 up to 2.5. So let's don't get it too complicated when it doesn't have to be. We're talking about interoperability within the paired bands, within a separate set of spectrum, and within the technologies that are separate technologies within those bands. Not 5 or 6 different bands and 6 different technologies. So, I don't know that I picked up the wrong nut, but I don't think the P was on there in the first place.
Do we have time for one other question from the audience? Or do we have one other question? I think you had your hand up first. Front row advantage there.
I'm Ryan Radia with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and more importantly, a custom Android ROM user as well. One of the more interesting mobile phone freedom stories lately has been that Toyota started advertising on Cydia, which is the Apple iPhone app store for jailbroken phones. Toyota ultimately stopped doing that, but the number I saw was that about 15 million users had jailbroken their iPhones and were using Cydia, which indicates that it's at least somewhat popular and perhaps growing in popularity. Even though now the largest platform for mobile operating systems is Android, which of course is much more free and less restrictive than iPhone. Then on the network side, there's this convergence towards LTE, both in the US and worldwide, meaning people will, at least in theory, be able to move their devices around more so than they used to. Is all this an indication that the market is moving in the direction of giving us mobile phone freedom, or am I missing something? And is there a need for more regulatory intervention than what we've had in the past?
I feel like to answer that, I would simply have to repeat what I said before. The question is going to be, in working with Apple, as various carriers work with Apple, what chipsets are they going to deploy in the device? And that's really the fundamental question. And believe me, Apple is very adamant about how they design their devices to ensure that they're delivering a device of high quality to their consumers. So the answer is really going to be about what chipsets in the device. Right now, there is not an LTE Apple device that I'm aware of. I don't even know that there's been any leaks on what's on the drawing board.
I found this weird phone in a bar the other day. Actually.
I will tell you, when we work with them, we're going to need, for an LTE perspective, at least 2, 700 and AWS. No one's talking about AWS, but that's going to be a big part of LTE deployment. If Verizon's working with them, they're going to want an upper 700 megahertz chipset. Again, if Lightsquird's working with them, they're going to want an MSS chipset. So again, it's going to depend on the relationships that are formed between Apple and the carriers and how the devices are designed.
Anyone else want to?
I'm not sure I actually understood the question.
I'm not sure I understood the question either, but I'm not sure if you're talking about applications or the ability.
Essentially, when you have a situation where a lot of customers, maybe the kind of tinkering, tweak-minded people who are putting their own software built on their phones, and sort of, they bought the phone, they're still paying the contract and abiding by the terms of it, but they've sort of taken matters into their own hands. That does seem to be a new development. I'm not aware of anyone who had a custom build of Palm OS on their Trio or their Centro, or anything similar with Windows Mobile.
Huh?
No, it was beyond my talents. Right? I mean,
I don't know if we're getting there. I mean, years ago when CMRS there was a little kit that it was a promo, a little kit you could buy and you build your own phone. And it was actually a cardboard, little square cardboard card that had the guts in it, and you built your own phone. And the company didn't last very long, obviously. It was analog. I don't know if we're actually coming to the customization side. I don't know if it's got to run on sometime, someplace, somewhere. It's got to come back to a network, and it's got to work on a network. So,
and I don't think anybody has figured out how to customize a phone to add chipset capabilities that is not in there when you buy the phone. So you might be able to add OS capabilities or other software capabilities, but I've just never heard of anybody adding chipset capabilities that aren't built in.
I think at the end of the day, people tend to forget carriers are in the business, firms are in the business of giving consumers what they want because they need to sell stuff to make money. And if that's where it's going, they may do that. But no disrespect, with constantly all this jailbreaking, this is the same point we had over the BitTorrent fight 4 years ago with Comcast. These do impose costs on the network, and then it's fun for a bunch of techie guys going, isn't this cool? But in the long run, somebody's got to pay for it. It ends up being the rest of us. So I cannot condone your unlawful behavior.
Well, I would just add that not in all cases are carriers doing what consumers want. You know, iPhone is the biggest example of consumers not wanting to be tied to a certain carrier. And so I think if carriers do want to give consumers what they want, we've seen in the survey consumers want the flexibility to have the devices of their choice with the services of their choice. So I think if everyone agrees that consumers, I think we all agree consumers do want, or I agree, some of us agree that consumers do want interoperability. And I think that's what we would like to see to ensure that consumers are getting what they want from carriers, and carriers aren't just deciding for consumers what they want.
Yes, but in the words of Austin Powers, I'd like the solid gold toilet, but that's not in the cards, is it? Yeah, I'd like a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that's,
right. But we're asking for something that's we are asking for something that's feasible.
With that, we have to wrap it up. It's 1:45. I've got a web chat at 2. 5-minute walk away from the office, fortunately. Thank you all. Thank you all.